I figured out a long time ago that there's a lot more to a forest than trees, and we do a wonderful job, probably the best job in the world, managing our forests for timber, but we do a very poor job managing our forests for medicinal and edible plants and all the herbaceous plants that are harvested from those forests. So I turned my attention years ago from timber production from the trees to what's growing below the trees. And now I focus my attention 100% of my time on the sustainable harvest and management of the non-timber products and resources from which they come. So I look at wild harvesting, sort of the bridge between wild harvesting and forest farming. So how do you take, if you have a stand of a forest and you're interested in managing that forest for black cohosh or ramps or ginseng or any of the herbaceous plants, what is needed to do that? And then if you want to actually farm your forest, to actually cultivate something underneath your forest, then what do you do with that? And how do you do that? And look at the impact that wild harvesting has on native populations. I got involved in the United Plant Savers about 10 years ago. I'm on the board of directors of the Plant Savers, and I really focus on the science behind medicinal plant and edible plants coming out of the forest. Does that answer you?
That's good.
I'm Callie Kincher. I'm a botanist, ecologist at the University of Kansas. I'm a very strong prairie enthusiast, prairie ethnobotanist. Done a lot of work with Great Plains Indian tribes, work with a lot of indigenous people, teach an ethnobotany class at KU. I've done a lot of work on echinacea, and that's kind of been the species that's kind of been with me in my career, including a 1986 economic botany publication on the ethnobotany of Echinacea angustifolia. And I've kept working with that because of conservation interest in issues. I've been on the board for the United Plant Savers, served a couple terms, was asked to join the board because I, like Jim, was a conservationist scientist, and has really felt that UPS, being known for its at-risk list, that is those medicinal plants at risk for overharvest, needed to have more science behind that listing. An example of that's echinacea. Echinacea was listed because of the large amount of harvest that's gone on, and it's been well documented by the American Herbal Products Association. And so there's great concern about overharvest in situations where Nature Conservancy preserves are having people come out and dig up the echinacea. There's just this great concern. Forest Service had lands where echinacea is being harvested literally in the middle of the night. And we get concerned about plants of being at risk for overharvest, particularly if they have the profile of something like ginseng. Long-lived plants, roots, where it's the roots that harvested that's medicinal, and you know, you kill that plant, slow reproduction rates, that's something of concern. We thought that was the profile for echinacea. Long-lived plants, the root was used in commerce. They do produce quite a few seeds. We started working with diggers, doing population work like people talked about today. And the diggers, in this case, folks in western Kansas, families been harvesting echinacea for decades, going clear back into the 1880s, 1890s. We're telling you can't get rid of this, that it keeps coming back. In fact, it resprouts. And I didn't believe that at first. And then, you know, whether you work with traditional people, you learn what they do, that's traditional ecological knowledge. They showed me resprouted roots. And so we did research on that, and lo and behold, half of the wild echinacea plants, when harvested, resprout. Well, that really helps those populations. So, on one hand, we're all concerned about overharvest, but there are situations where you can harvest sustainably. And I think that's of great interest, is to determine which plants truly are at risk for being overharvested in the wild. And there's many reasons that we want to harvest plants in the wild. Wouldn't you rather work in the wild? You know, I think most of us here like being in the field. If it's something we can do sustainably, I think that's a wonderful thing to do. In addition to cultivating, and we need a mix, obviously. So I'm very interested in this issue as a conservationist, and I like telling people about United Plant Savers that it is the medicinal plant conservation organization. The only organization that's really just focused on conservation of medicinal plants. Thank you.
I'm Stephen Dentali, Science Officer for the American Herbal Products Association. I don't usually sound like this. I think I swallowed a frog in the swamp yesterday. APA's been around for 30 years, and APA's president, Michael McGuffin, has been a long-standing member of the UPS board. I'm going to take a few minutes to show you we've been conducting a tonnage survey, and I want to show you a little bit of data on golden seal and touch on black cohosh. So I've got some slides that I'll present here. Well, I'll mention, by the way, I was a member of Rosemary Gladstar's first graduating class of her herb school that she started back in Santa Rosa in that area. And I was at an SEB meeting in Chicago in 1983. I think that's when I met you, Trish. And I thought, what a great group of people, what a lot of fun this is. And then I came back to a meeting in New York City, I believe, and that was also a wonderful meeting with a lot of good science data. Some of it I recall on replanting and harvesting techniques to look at what was done with certain populations. I really appreciated that at the time, and I was lucky enough to come back, and Michael said, hey, we're being asked to come speak here. You know, probably you or I should go. And I don't know which one of us should go yet. Probably you or I. And I'm thinking, I was thinking of going. He goes, all right, you go ahead. You go ahead. So, luckily we've got our tonnage survey just coming out this week. And
Are we in the way?
Yeah.
You could probably just move over. Yeah. Let's
Things in different places here. I'm used to because I have an old version. Where is start the slideshow? Tell me if I'm getting warm. Bottom right? Oh, there it is. Yeah, it's in the bottom left of the version. I'm going to hold it. Okay. Also, another thing it does, it takes stars and bullets and turns them into mailboxes. So really little, you have mailboxes all going through this. So the American Herbal Products Association is a trade association. It exists to promote the responsible commerce of products that contain herbal ingredients. It represents about 300 members of all different types of suppliers, processors, manufacturers, retailers, etc. We promote self-regulation, give tools and other things, educational sessions. We've got Herbs of Commerce actually is a book that's used to give common names for standardized Latin names. The regulations require to use a common name. If you're selling tea, you need to say you're selling tea, not just Camellia sinensis. So since a common name needs to be used, and there's so many different common names that can be used for a single botanical, we've got a listing of individual common names to go with the Latin names that is widely used. You know, retailers use this, manufacturers use it, and FDA uses it. We've got another edition of the Botanical Safety Handbook coming out. This is the first edition, second edition will be out probably within a year. We've got some other guidelines of what's product standardization. So these are just examples of some of the tools that we produce for industry. The tonnage survey is, the recent one is from surveys from 2006 to 2010. It's to quantify annual harvests of certain North American herbs in commerce, and the data represents aggregate quantities supplied by companies that serve as raw material suppliers to the trade. So why bother counting? Well, golden seal has been CITES listed. That was done back in around 97, yeah, 97. So there's lots of hoops you got to jump through if you're going to export that. Is that justified or not? Well, we decided to look at what people were harvesting for golden seal, or growing for golden seal, to get some solid data to enable informed decisions to defend the use of ongoing sustainable use of these plants, if that's indeed the case. The previous surveys were conducted. Initially, like I said, we started with golden seal only. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Department of the Interior said this is a vital index of native U.S. botanical consumption, because it's the only one out there, so it's got to be good, right? Participants, the primary raw material suppliers. They're people that are either cultivating directly or harvesting from the wild directly, or people that are consolidating plants from people that are getting it from the wild. The idea is we want to get into the supply chain at some point and count what we can, but not count it twice. I think some of the first surveys were counting things twice. So we have about, let's see, get out here, 26, we cover 26 commodities, 22 species, and I'm going to show some graphs that cover black coash, Cascara sagrada, slippery elm, and golden seal. It's about 23 companies that participated in these last two surveys. We don't know how many are out there. We rely on word of mouth, we rely on suppliers who can tell us who other suppliers are. So we don't know what proportion of the total trade in these plants is represented in the survey, nor do we have any means of assuring the information is accurate. So here's a chart going back to, back up one, from 99 through 2010. Yellow line here is golden seal. It was kind of a high around here. It's been fairly stable throughout. I have some more data on that I'll show. This slippery elm bark has kind of gone up and down. It is recognized USP demulcent. And Cascara sagrada is very interesting because of the fact that this was an over-the-counter drug for treating as a laxative drug. In around 2003, it lost that status. There was no one to support it. FDA said, look, we've got all these really old over-the-counter drug monographs. Is anyone using this stuff? And can you prove to us that it's safe, that the anthraquinone glycosides in there are not causing problems? Center was able to get enough data together. There were no champions with enough data to save Cascara sagrada from being listed as a over-the-counter drug, so it fell off the map. I got calls from 2 hospital administrators. I said, what do I do? This stuff is great. It works fine. There's not a problem with it. It's the best one that we have. And I could say, well, you can still buy a supplementary supplement. But it's not available as an over-the-counter drug anymore. And as you can see, the harvests, 2004, it climbed since then, and it's reached pretty much new heights up to 200 tons of dried material. There's only about a couple of collectors, a couple of consolidators in the Northwest, maybe one now. And I called some years ago and talked to one of the people that supplied the 2 large houses. And he said, yeah, people used to come out and collect this as they're going on a picnic. They'd harvest a little Cascara root, they'd send it in, they'd earn some money. Now it's pretty much just a few people who have the permits to do it, and they go out and maybe 5 or 6 collectors, and it's their business to do that. So that really how that's collected has changed. And he was saying, you know, I'm doing this for a few more years, but all the people around me are gone who've been doing this. But I'm so glad to see that there's still a good market for it. Black cohosh had some climbing up to here. Interesting to me that all these 3 were about the same, tracking the same, and then they varied to 09. You know, why this dip, I don't know. Maybe it was market demand. And then they're all back around 170 tons dried material. So these are, other than echinacea and saw palmetto, out of all those 26 different commodities that are traded in, these are the 4 highest for tonnage. So this shows golden seal for fresh. We track fresh and dried. Fresh is minimal. Dried, this is really just that section of the golden seal chart from here on. So the scale's blown up so you can see the fluctuations a little more dramatically. Reaching a low in 03, and then fairly stable, although down a little bit the last couple of years. And then this is separating wild harvests from cultivated harvests. Some images that pulled off the web, slice of root here. And this is the same data but stacked on top of each other, so you can see the wild root harvest and then the cultivated root. And the total, obviously, would be the size of each of these bars. So again, since 04 on, it's been fairly stable from what we've been tracking. We do try and get the same people each time. There was one supplier that I got to provide, who's estimating 5,000 tons a year. So I was lucky to get that data again. Without that, these numbers would be down to here, but we just wouldn't see what was being cultivated. So I hope to get his contributions next time. We're going to try and do this every couple of years. This is the same thing, but it's making all these to be 100% and shows the percentages of wild golden still versus dry. See, back in '98, there was very little cultivated, and a lot of cultivation efforts. We used to track how many acres do you have under cultivation, what's your annual yield going to be, and the numbers for projection were so far off, we just dropped it. It was not useful at all. So actually, I don't have the later years in here, but you can see the relative portions here. I've got a poster on this also, poster 37, so there's some more information on that poster I'll be buying later today. And what I wanted to show is how does this fit into what was going on historically. So right here is where some of the numbers started on a lot of these charts. If you go back to 98, 97, here's a data point that wasn't represented with black co-wash on that other slide. It would have been off the graph. So what happened here? And did we like wipe everything out, so that's why this is so much lower? No, what happened here was an experiment that the mass market decided to try herbs. And rather than just being in health food stores, it was in every Walgreens, every CVS, every Walmart. Remember that? Remember when everybody got used herbs because all the people, all the major manufacturers started selling it, and all the suppliers, all the retailers really wanted it. Well, all that product came back. Echinacea shows the same thing. It may have been a year or so before. It was a huge peak for echinacea around this time. So I think the takeaway point from this is that market demand is certainly an important factor in harvest. If there's not a demand for it, it's not going to be cultivated. And for some of these sawtooth patterns, as mentioned earlier, people may be holding harvests for a bad year. People may buy one year when it's cheap and then not need it the next year. Particularly echinacea has shown the sawtooth pattern. That's fairly common in business. What we've also done recently, looking at OSHA, we had a member company say, hey, we're selling OSHA. We have no idea how sustainable this is being harvested in southeast Colorado. So we put out a foundation that we have, put out a request for proposals. So we're reviewing grant proposals now to determine the current status of wild populations of Lagusca and Porter Island Poteri, commonly known as OSHA. Because we can't tell about if we need to protect this or not, because we can't verify what's actually going on with it. We don't have scientific data on the populations or factors that could enhance or threaten its survival. So the objective is to obtain information about the status in the wild and sustainable harvests that would ensure the survival of the species. Last slide. Oh, that wasn't the slide.
I do think that we could have much more sustainable wild harvests, but I think one of the roles that needs to be filled, and seeing a lot of students out there and other younger folks, we really need a lot more baseline data. We really need to understand plants and plant materials better. We really need to think about, the whole ecological cycle of plants. And also, as researchers, there's lots of opportunities to study plants, make new discoveries, and we also need to be thoughtful about that. One of the things you're hearing about as problems is using roots of long-lived perennial plants. For those of us who do work on drug discovery, and I'm one of those, it's much better to look at leaves than it is to look at roots. If you have an opportunity, if you're collecting plant material for someone doing research, if they don't really care, give them leaves. Or if you're looking at species, we were doing work on milkweeds, and we made some really interesting chemical discoveries. We've got new compounds in milkweeds, basically common milkweed. But being the person heading up the plant list for what we collected, I did not put Asclepias medii on that list. And it's an endangered species in Kansas and the Midwest. And we have enough of it, I could collect enough for testing. And at some level, that'd be interesting, wouldn't it, to know what this rare species has. But since the goal of our project was trying to find marketable things, I did not want to have marketable products come out of an endangered species because it's not only rare, it's slow growing, it's small, and why add pressure to a species that's got enough troubles? So I think as researchers, we have lots of opportunities to deal with this issue of sustainability, both coming and going, both product and upfront with ecological research, and there's tremendous amounts of opportunity.
I don't know if I can follow that. I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman over coffee this morning, and he said, you didn't talk anything about sustainability in your presentation about ramps. And I am remiss that I did not, because I'm very concerned about the sustainability of that those plants. And we continually promote the usage of these plants. And if you look at ramps as an example, before 1992 or 93, early 90s, people were out there collecting these products and they were having these festivals, and that was pretty much all of what was happening. And then Martha Stewart got a hold of these plants, and she published it in her magazine of how great these plants were. And then you saw it happening in Cooking Light magazine, and then you saw it happening on the internet, and then you saw it happening time and time again, saying these are the greatest things since sliced bread. And I was in New York City 3 weeks ago at a farmer's market, and this guy told me, a vendor told me he was going to harvest 20,000 pounds of ramps this year. And he looked at me in the eye and said, we're not having any impact on the plants. And by golly, you're having an impact. Anytime you pull a plant up by its roots, you're having an impact on that plant population to repopulate itself. You're having an impact on that plant population to produce seeds and to produce young. And we see that in all the plants that are being harvested for their root material. Anytime you pull up a plant by its roots, whether it's ramps or ginseng or black cohosh, you have to have an impact.
So
Now,
how do we get people to eat ramp leaves? You mentioned that. And how can we get that?
yeah, that's a really good question. How do you get them to cut just the leaves off? But even that has an impact because it cuts the scape or the developing flower stalk. You know, so there has to be a balance. I think we can do it. I know we can do it. We did it with trees. We produce timber on a sustainable basis. You may not agree with cutting timber, but we do it. And we can grow particularly hardwood forests. We can go out there and cut that forest right there. 50 years from now, you won't be able to tell the difference. We can do it. We just need to do the science behind it to figure out what are the inputs and what are the outputs and what are the impacts from harvesting, what is the mortality rate, what's the mean annual growth increment, what's the mean annual sloughing off or decline in the plant, and look at the variables in that, and we can figure that out. She had a question too.
I just want to respond to that first. One thing I really like about herbs, I was trained as a national parks chemist, pharmacognosist. After Rosemary's school, I went around and thought, you know, I really want to learn chemistry, but it seems so boring. I actually tried a couple of times. I finally managed to pass that and had a good course, and wanted to learn about this field because none of the herbalists I knew could read a scientific journal, and none of the scientists at that point, none of the pharmacognostists knew what echinacea was. So I continued down that. And one thing that I really related to in pharmacognosy were the knowledge that was common knowledge back in the 40s and 50s. So I imagine it was because pharmacists were still using medicinal plants. They were following the existing USP monographs. Black cohosh was listed in the USP or the National Formulary from the beginning in 1820 to 1950. And all of the plants sort of fell out of the USP. Now we're kind of trying to job them back together in a way that makes sense. And the textbooks of pharmacognosy in the early 60s talk about plants like sarsaparilla. And they show how the bundle comes, this long plant that makes like a rope kind of thing, and how it would be wound and delivered, because that crude drug, that crude plant, comes from Jamaica or Honduras or Ecuador, wherever. And they would say in the commentary, well, everyone knows that stuff's from Jamaica or wherever it was. And another edition later, around the 1970s or early, those sections that gave the photographs and talked about the origin of it started getting smaller and smaller till they almost disappeared. And ironically, it was a lot of people who were reading the old USPs, reading the old monographs, reading the old eclectic materia medicas, the old dispensatories. They were starting to make tinctures again, starting to use plants the way they were used before, and really needed that information that was falling out of the colleges of pharmacy and medicinal chemistry classes. What I'm related to is getting those herbs shipped from a foreign country, and that it's a cultural artifact. We happen to eat it, we happen to make medicine out of it, but it's no different than a piece of pottery or a painting or something that's produced by a culture of expression of how they're living their life. I know that's what you look at when you're looking at, economic botany and ethnobotany. And then I think that is a part that always needs to be considered, is what is the cultural milieu of how these things are being used and if we're going to redo something, how's it fitting into the culture that we have?
Does somebody have a question? Do you want to come up here so everybody can hear you?
It's not really a question, it's epilogue on my talk.
This brings up one other thing that I did not have time to discuss in my talk, and that is the sustainability issue. And with ginseng, my data that I presented, or Aaron's data and my data, shows the genetic diversity of ginseng. And there is a lot of controversy about supplementing wild populations. And the caution that I want to bring is that ginseng is very genetically diverse. There are differences between geographic regions. There is local adaptation, as was not shown very clearly by the fitness data, but it is shown by the phytochemical data. So my point is, if you're going to be supplementing, which is one way to be sustainable, make sure that you know what you're supplementing with. We found these wild populations that obviously had exotic germplasm in them. Okay, I think that if we want to sustain and conserve and keep genetic integrity, we need things like simple DNA tests. So we don't have to look at the roots, but we can tell the relationships. And the regulations say that you're supposed to harvest ginseng roots and replant the seeds next to where that plant is. And I wonder how often that is really done. But it reminds me of what's done with the forest. You reseed, but in the case at least of ginseng, it must be of local germplasm.
Thank you. We have about, sure, one more question.
Jim, this question is for you. In your presentation, you made a comment that the permitting process changed, and that's why people didn't harvest.
Right.
And I want to know what the social and the political fallout of that change of the permitting process was.
And what was that change?
Oh, well, yeah, I didn't really. There were two changes, actually. There were two changes that were made, and I'm not sure I'm going to get in. Around 2002, the Great Smoky Mountain National Park published a report that said ramp harvesting was not sustainable, and the only way to sustain ramp harvesting was to harvest 10% of the patch every 10 years, right? So you could very little of it. And before that, they allowed the Native Americans to harvest ramps in the park, and they stopped it, which really created intense social tension, as you can imagine. Interestingly enough, I was watching the permits, the National Forest issue permits for you individuals to harvest. And in the next year, there was many more permits handed out for people in the Cherokee area. You could see this through the addresses, which was interesting. So there was an increase in permits from this particular population. Then in 2006, was it 2006, January 2006, the National Forest began limiting the number of permits that were issued for ramp collecting, and that organizations that wanted to harvest for commercial purposes, whether that was for commerce or for the ramp festivals, they were going to be charged 50 cents a pound for that. And the organization said we can't afford to do that. So they stopped digging. I was persona non grata in a lot of these groups. They said, you're with the federal government. Even though I'm research, I'm not National Forest. And we need to make that clear. I'm not National Forest, so I can't speak to the impact of the policies. But they said, basically, we're not going to collect anymore as an organization. We're going to send our individual people out there and collect. And that way, that lost our ability to actually track the harvesting of ramps on those forests. Several of the groups stopped harvesting and started buying their plants, their bulbs. Does that answer your question?
Well, I guess it starts
Yeah. It's a, I mean, I could,
evolve.
it's a long,
We
yeah.
just got the nod that we're out of time on our panel discussion, but I want to thank the panel members for the discussion. I also want to mention UPS has 2 upcoming events. One is Planting the Future at Sage Mountain with Marie Gladstar's home and school. And we are putting on an international sandalwood symposium in Hawaii in October. And if you have any questions about that, come and talk to me. And I guess I just want to end on this note. I want to thank Sunshine for making a big effort to include UPS in this gathering, and for everybody here to sort of think about that relationship between research and activism, and to see UPS as that bridge between those two, and to encourage you to check out our journal and to submit your research to publish in our journal. And with that, I think there's a movie next. Right.